This rescue bear talks nonstop. Try not to smile at his goofy antics. The old radio crackled with static as Frank Morrison adjusted the frequency dial with weathered fingers. At 65, his hands bore the scars of decades fighting fires in Tennessee, but now they trembled slightly as he worked on the ancient device that had become his only companion. In the isolated cabin, the Smoky Mountains stretched endlessly beyond his windows, their peaks shrouded in winter mist that seemed to mirror the fog that had settled over his heart 10 years ago. Frank had once been a hero, Captain Frank Morrison of the Tennessee Fire Department. They used to call him the Shield. He'd saved countless lives, pulled families from burning buildings, and earned the respect of every man and woman who wore the badge. But all the lives he'd saved couldn't make up for the two he'd lost when it mattered most. His wife, Sarah, and their 8-year-old son, Tommy, had perished in a house fire while Frank was trapped across town fighting another blaze. By the time he'd arrived at his own burning home, there was nothing left but ash and the crushing weight of failure that would follow him for the rest of his days. The cabin had belonged to Sarah's grandfather, a place where they'd spent happy summers when Tommy was small. Now it served as Frank's refuge from a world that held too many memories. He'd withdrawn completely, ignoring the concerned calls from former colleagues and the gentle invitations from neighbors who still remembered the man he used to be. The radio repair work kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, though nothing could truly silence the voices that haunted his dreams. On this particular February night, the wind howled through the bare branches outside, rattling the cabin's windows and sending drafts through the gaps in the old wooden walls. Frank hunched over his workbench, squinting at the radio's internal components through reading glasses that had seen better days. The device was a vintage model from the 1970s, the kind that could pick up signals from hundreds of miles away when properly tuned. He'd been working on it for weeks, trying to restore its original clarity. As he adjusted a loose wire, the headphones suddenly filled with an unusual sound. Frank paused, frowning as he listened more carefully. It wasn't the typical static or distant music he expected. Instead, he heard what sounded like conversation, but not human conversation. The sounds were rhythmic, almost musical, with a quality that reminded him of someone trying to communicate in a language he didn't understand. Frank turned the dial slowly, trying to isolate the signal. The sounds grew clearer, more distinct. There were pauses, as if one party was waiting for a response, then more vocalizations that seemed to carry different emotional tones. Sometimes they sounded plaintive, almost pleading. Other times they carried a note of frustration or confusion. "What in the hell?" Frank muttered, pulling the headphones off and looking around the cabin. The sounds were definitely coming through the radio, but they were unlike anything he had ever heard on the airwaves. He put the headphones back on and listened more intently, trying to determine the source. The signal seemed to be coming from somewhere very close by. Frank stood up, still wearing the headphones, and began walking around the cabin. The sounds grew stronger as he moved toward the back door, weaker as he moved away. His curiosity overrode his usual reluctance to venture outside in the bitter cold. Frank pulled on his heavy coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the frigid night air. The snow crunched under his feet as he followed the signal, which seemed to be emanating from somewhere behind the cabin. The headphone cord stretched to its limit, forcing him to remove them and rely on his ears alone. That's when he heard it clearly for the first time without the radio's interference. The sounds were definitely coming from the old abandoned truck that had been rusting behind his cabin for years. Frank approached cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The truck had been there when he'd moved in, a relic from some previous owner who'd left it to decay among the trees. As he got closer, the sounds became more urgent, more desperate. Frank peered into the truck's cab and saw nothing, but the vocalizations were definitely coming from inside the vehicle. He walked around to the back and found that the tailgate was partially open, creating a gap just large enough for a small animal to squeeze through. Frank aimed his flashlight into the truck bed and gasped. Huddled in the far corner was a black bear cub, no more than a few months old. The little creature was trapped, too weak to climb back out the way it had entered. Its fur was matted with mud and what looked like dried blood, and around its neck was a chain that had cut into the skin, leaving a raw, infected wound. The cub looked up at Frank with eyes that seemed far too old for such a young animal. They were wet with tears and filled with a desperate plea for help. In that moment, Frank was transported back 10 years to the last time he'd seen his son, Tommy, those same pleading eyes looking up at him from a hospital bed, asking why Daddy couldn't make the hurt go away. The cub made another sound, softer this time, almost conversational. It was as if the little bear was trying to explain its situation, to tell Frank how it had ended up trapped and injured. Frank had heard plenty of bear sounds during his years in the mountains, but nothing like this. This cub seemed to be genuinely attempting to communicate. Frank knew he should call animal control or the park service. That would be the responsible thing to do. But something about the cub's eyes, about the way it seemed to be speaking to him, made him hesitate. The little bear was so small, so vulnerable in its current condition. It might not survive the stress of being handled by strangers and transported to a wildlife facility. "Easy there, little one," Frank said softly, approaching the truck slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The cub watched him warily, but didn't try to retreat further into the corner. If anything, it seemed to relax slightly at the sound of Frank's voice. It made another sound, this one almost questioning, as if asking whether Frank could be trusted. Frank reached into the truck bed carefully, moving slowly to avoid startling the frightened animal. The cub allowed him to get close enough to examine the chain around its neck. It was a heavy logging chain, far too large for such a small animal. Someone had clearly used it to restrain the cub, probably keeping it as an illegal pet before abandoning it to fend for itself. "This is going to hurt a little," Frank warned. Working to loosen the chain, the cub whimpered, but held still, seeming to understand that Frank was trying to help. When the chain finally came free, the cub made a sound that could only be described as relief. Frank gently lifted the small bear from the truck bed. It was lighter than he'd expected, clearly malnourished and dehydrated. The cub didn't struggle in his arms. Instead, it seemed to melt against his chest, making soft rumbling sounds that reminded Frank of a cat's purr. Back inside the cabin, Frank wrapped the cub in an old wool blanket that Sarah had knitted years ago. The little bear snuggled into the soft fabric, its constant vocalizations now taking on a more contented tone. Frank found himself responding to the sounds, talking to the cub as if it were a human child. "You're safe now," he murmured, settling into his rocking chair with the bundled cub in his arms. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The cub looked up at him and made a series of sounds that seemed almost like a response. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that the little bear was actually trying to tell him something, to share its story of how it had ended up alone and injured in the wilderness. "You're quite the talker, aren't you?" Frank said with a slight smile, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd felt in years. "I think I'll call you Chatter." As if approving of the name, Chatter made a pleased rumbling sound and settled more comfortably in Frank's arms. For the first time in a decade, Frank Morrison didn't feel completely alone in the world. Over the next few days, Frank devoted himself entirely to nursing Chatter back to health. The cub was weaker than he'd initially realized, barely able to lift its head when Frank first brought it inside. He mixed honey into warm oatmeal, feeding Chatter small spoonfuls every few hours. The little bear accepted the food gratefully, making soft, appreciative sounds between bites. Frank cleaned and dressed the wound on Chatter's neck, applying antibiotic ointment and changing the bandages twice daily. The cub bore these ministrations with remarkable patience, as if understanding that Frank was trying to help. Sometimes Chatter would make questioning sounds during the treatment, and Frank found himself explaining what he was doing, talking to the bear as if it were a human patient. "This might sting a little," Frank would say as he cleaned the wound, "but it's going to help you heal faster." Chatter would respond with a soft grunt that sounded almost like acknowledgement, then hold perfectly still while Frank worked. The old firefighter had treated plenty of injuries over the years, but he'd never had such a cooperative patient. At night, Frank made a bed for Chatter near the wood stove, using old blankets and pillows to create a warm, comfortable nest. But the cub had other ideas. Every time Frank tried to settle it in its designated sleeping area, Chatter would make plaintive sounds and crawl over to Frank's chair, climbing up to curl against his chest. "You're going to be too big for this soon," Frank warned. But he didn't have the heart to force the frightened animal to sleep alone. Instead, he spent those first few nights dozing in his rocking chair with Chatter snuggled against him. The cub's steady breathing and occasional sleepy murmurs providing a comfort Frank hadn't felt in years. As Chatter grew stronger, its personality began to emerge more clearly. The cub was incredibly vocal, making different sounds for different situations. When hungry, it would make short, urgent grunts. When content, it would purr like an oversized cat. When curious about something, it would make questioning chirps that rose in pitch at the end, almost like human speech patterns. Frank found himself responding to these vocalizations naturally, carrying on what felt like genuine conversations with the bear. He would ask Chatter questions, and the cub would respond with sounds that seemed to match the context perfectly. When Frank asked if Chatter was hungry, the response would be either an eager, affirmative grunt or a dismissive snort, depending on the cub's actual appetite. "You really are trying to talk to me, aren't you?" Frank mused one morning as he prepared Chatter's breakfast. The cub sat nearby, making a series of sounds that seemed to be describing its night's sleep, or perhaps commenting on the weather. As the days passed, Frank began to notice patterns in Chatter's vocalizations. The cub had developed what could only be called a morning routine, reporting to Frank about everything that had happened overnight. These reports were elaborate affairs, with Chatter making a variety of sounds that seemed to tell a complete story. Sometimes the reports were brief and cheerful, suggesting a peaceful night. Other times they were longer and more complex, as if Chatter had experienced dreams or heard interesting sounds outside. Frank started responding to these reports, asking follow-up questions and making comments. To his amazement, Chatter seemed to understand and would adjust its vocalizations accordingly. If Frank expressed concern about something in the report, Chatter would make reassuring sounds. If Frank seemed interested in a particular detail, Chatter would elaborate with additional sounds and gestures. The old firefighter had always been a practical man, someone who dealt in facts and evidence. But there was no denying that something extraordinary was happening between him and this remarkable cub. Chatter wasn't just making random animal sounds, it was genuinely attempting to communicate, to share its experiences and emotions with Frank. As winter began to give way to early spring, Frank realized that he faced a difficult decision. Chatter was growing rapidly, already twice the size it had been when Frank first found it. Soon, the cub would be too large to keep safely in the cabin. The responsible thing would be to contact wildlife authorities and arrange for Chatter to be relocated to a proper facility or released back into the wild. But the thought of losing Chatter filled Frank with a dread he hadn't felt since the night he'd lost his family. The little bear had become more than just a rescued animal, it had become his companion, his confidant, his reason for getting up each morning. The conversations they shared, however unusual they might seem to others, had begun to heal wounds that Frank had thought would never mend. Frank made his decision on a warm March morning as he watched Chatter playing in the yard outside the cabin. The cub had found an old tennis ball and was batting it around, making delighted sounds each time it bounced in an unexpected direction. Every few minutes, Chatter would look over at Frank and make a sound that clearly meant, "Are you watching this?" Frank would respond with encouragement, and Chatter would return to its game with renewed enthusiasm. That afternoon, Frank began building an enclosure attached to the back of his cabin. It would be large enough for Chatter to move around freely, but secure enough to keep the growing bear safe from hunters and other dangers. The enclosure would have a door that connected to Frank's kitchen, allowing Chatter to come inside during bad weather or when it wanted company. Chatter supervised the construction project with great interest, making commentary sounds about Frank's progress and occasionally trying to help by bringing him tools or pieces of wood. The cub's assistance was more hindrance than help, but Frank found himself laughing at Chatter's earnest attempts to contribute to the project. "You're going to be the death of me," Frank said as Chatter proudly presented him with a hammer that the cub had dragged over from the other side of the yard. "But I suppose that's better than dying alone." Chatter made a sound that seemed to express agreement, then settled down to watch Frank work, occasionally offering what sounded like encouragement or advice. For the first time in 10 years, Frank Morrison felt like he had a purpose again, a reason to build something instead of just maintaining what was left of his broken life. The enclosure was completed just as Chatter reached the size where sleeping in Frank's chair was no longer practical. The young bear took to its new home immediately, exploring every corner and making sounds that Frank interpreted as approval. But Chatter's favorite feature was the door that connected the enclosure to Frank's kitchen. The bear would use it dozens of times each day, coming inside to check on Frank, then going back outside to play or explore. Frank's daily routine began to revolve around Chatter's schedule. Each morning, the bear would come inside and deliver its overnight report, a complex series of vocalizations that seemed to cover everything from the weather to interesting sounds heard in the forest. Frank would listen attentively, asking questions and making comments, treating these sessions as seriously as any conversation with a human friend. "So, you heard an owl last night?" Frank would ask, and Chatter would respond with a series of sounds that seemed to describe not just the owl's call, but its location and perhaps even its size. Frank found himself becoming fluent in Chatter's language, understanding subtle differences in tone and pitch that conveyed specific meanings. The bear's intelligence continued to amaze Frank. Chatter learned to perform simple tasks around the cabin, bringing in firewood, fetching Frank's reading glasses, and even helping with basic maintenance chores. But it was Chatter's emotional intelligence that truly set it apart. The bear seemed to sense Frank's moods, offering comfort when the old man was sad and sharing in his rare moments of joy. One evening, as Frank worked on repairing another old radio, Chatter settled beside him and began making rhythmic sounds that seemed to harmonize with the static coming from the device. Frank paused in his work, listening to what could only be described as Chatter singing along with the radio. "You've got quite a voice there," Frank said, adjusting the radio's frequency. Chatter's vocalizations changed to match the new sounds, creating an oddly beautiful duet between bear and machine. Frank had forgotten that his radio's microphone was still connected and transmitting miles away. People listening to their radio suddenly heard something unprecedented, a bear singing in harmony with electronic static. The local radio station's phone lines lit up with calls from amazed listeners wanting to know about this new show. When Frank realized what had happened, he quickly switched off the microphone. But the damage was done. Word spread quickly through the small mountain communities about the singing bear that had been heard on the radio. Frank tried to dismiss the inquiries, but Chatter seemed to enjoy the attention, making pleased sounds whenever Frank mentioned the incident. "You want to be famous, don't you?" Frank asked. And Chatter responded with what sounded remarkably like laughter. As spring turned to summer, Frank began allowing Chatter more freedom to explore the surrounding forest. The bear would disappear for hours at a time, but it always returned by sunset, usually with something to show Frank or a story to tell through its elaborate vocalizations. One day, Chatter discovered Frank's mailbox at the end of the long driveway. The bear became fascinated with the daily mail delivery, and Frank taught it to retrieve the letters and bring them back to the cabin. But Chatter didn't just fetch the mail, it developed a system for reporting on each piece. Bills received a short, annoyed growl, as if Chatter understood that these were unwelcome communications. Letters from Frank's few remaining friends were greeted with happy purrs and excited sounds. Advertisements got dismissive snorts, while official documents prompted concerned whimpers that seemed to ask if Frank was in trouble. "You're a better mail sorter than the post office," Frank told Chatter one afternoon as the bear carefully arranged the day's delivery according to its own mysterious system. Chatter made a proud sound and settled down to watch Frank open each letter, providing commentary on the contents based on Frank's reactions. The local children were initially terrified of Chatter, having been raised on stories about dangerous bears in the mountains. But word of the talking bear eventually reached their parents, and curiosity overcame fear. The first brave child to approach Chatter was a little girl named Emma, whose family lived about a mile down the mountain. Emma had heard the stories about the bear that could sing and talk, and she wanted to see for herself. She approached Frank's cabin one afternoon while her mother waited nervously at the edge of the property. Chatter was in the yard playing with a stick when it noticed the little girl watching from behind a tree. Instead of acting aggressively, Chatter sat down and made a gentle sound that seemed designed to be non-threatening. Emma stepped out from behind the tree, and Chatter began what could only be described as a performance. The bear stood on its hind legs, made a series of musical sounds, then dropped back down and rolled over, making what sounded like laughter. Emma giggled, and Chatter seemed to take this as encouragement. The bear began telling a story through an elaborate series of sounds and gestures, acting out what appeared to be an adventure in the forest. Emma was delighted, clapping her hands and asking questions that Chatter seemed to understand and respond to. From that day forward, Chatter became a local attraction. Families would bring their children to see the performing bear, and Chatter seemed to relish the role. The bear developed a repertoire of tricks and stories, always seeming to know exactly what would delight its young audience. Frank watched these performances with a mixture of pride and amazement. Chatter had somehow learned to read human emotions and respond appropriately, providing exactly the kind of entertainment that each child needed. Shy children received gentle, encouraging sounds, while bold ones got more elaborate performances. "You're a natural entertainer," Frank told Chatter after a particularly successful show for a group of visiting children. Chatter made a pleased sound and settled down for a nap, clearly exhausted from its efforts. But it wasn't just the children who were charmed by Chatter. The bear's reputation spread throughout the mountain communities, and people began making special trips just to meet the famous talking bear. Frank found himself hosting more visitors than he'd seen in the previous 10 years combined. At first, Frank was uncomfortable with all the attention. He'd grown accustomed to his solitude and wasn't sure he wanted his quiet life disrupted by curious strangers. But he noticed that the visitors seemed to bring out the best in Chatter, and the bear's obvious joy in performing gradually won Frank over. One autumn afternoon, Frank was working in his garden when he slipped on wet leaves and fell hard, injuring his leg. The pain was intense, and he couldn't get back to his feet. Chatter, who had been exploring nearby, immediately rushed to Frank's side and began making loud, urgent sounds. When Frank didn't respond to Chatter's usual vocalizations, the bear began roaring at the top of its lungs, a sound that carried for miles through the mountain air. A hiker passing on a nearby trail heard the commotion and came to investigate, finding Frank injured and Chatter standing guard over him. The hiker called for help, and soon Frank was on his way to the hospital with a broken leg. Throughout the ordeal, Chatter remained by his side, making worried sounds and refusing to leave, even when the paramedics tried to shoo the bear away. "That bear saved your life," the hiker told Frank later. "If it hadn't called for help, you might have been out there all night." Frank's recovery took several weeks, during which Chatter appointed itself as his personal nurse. The bear brought Frank water, kept him warm with extra blankets, and provided constant companionship during the long, painful days of healing. Chatter seemed to understand that Frank was hurt and adjusted its behavior accordingly, making softer, more comforting sounds instead of its usual exuberant vocalizations. "You're taking better care of me than any human nurse," Frank told Chatter one evening as the bear gently placed a fresh ice pack on his injured leg. Chatter made a pleased sound and settled down beside Frank's chair, ready to provide whatever comfort was needed. As Frank healed, he began to reflect on how much his life had changed since finding Chatter. The bear had not only saved him from physical danger, but had also rescued him from the emotional isolation that had consumed him for so long. Through their daily conversations and shared experiences, Frank had rediscovered his capacity for joy and connection. Chatter continued to grow, eventually reaching full adult size. The bear was now massive, easily twice Frank's weight and capable of considerable strength. But despite its size, Chatter remained gentle and affectionate, treating Frank with the same careful consideration it had shown as a cub. The bear's playful nature also remained unchanged. Chatter still loved to play hide-and-seek, stealing Frank's gloves and hats and hiding them in various locations around the property. Frank would pretend to search frantically for the missing items while Chatter watched from a hiding spot, making sounds that seemed like barely contained laughter. "You're going to be the death of me," Frank would say when he finally found his hat buried under a pile of leaves. And Chatter would respond with sounds that clearly indicated the bear was pleased with his successful prank. These games became a regular part of their routine, with Chatter constantly devising new ways to entertain both itself and Frank. The bear would hide Frank's tools, rearrange his garden decorations, or create elaborate obstacle courses using fallen branches and rocks. Frank learned to appreciate these disruptions as expressions of Chatter's creativity and affection. On quiet evenings, Frank would sit on his porch with Chatter lying beside him, the bear's massive head resting on Frank's lap. These were the moments Frank treasured most, when the two of them would simply enjoy each other's company without the need for words or sounds. During these peaceful interludes, Frank would often tell Chatter about his past, sharing memories of his wife Sarah and son Tommy that he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. Chatter would listen attentively, making soft, sympathetic sounds that seemed to acknowledge Frank's pain and offer comfort. "You know, I used to think I was being punished," Frank said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I thought I deserved to be alone because I couldn't save them. But maybe I was being prepared for you." Chatter made a gentle rumbling sound and nuzzled closer to Frank, as if understanding the significance of this admission. For Frank, it was a moment of profound healing, a recognition that his life still had purpose and meaning. As the years passed, Frank and Chatter became local legends. Stories about the talking bear spread far beyond the mountain communities, attracting visitors from across the state and beyond. Frank eventually had to limit the number of visitors in order to protect both Chatter's well-being and his own privacy. But he made exceptions for children and families who had traveled long distances to meet the famous bear. Chatter seemed to understand its celebrity status and rose to the occasion, always putting on special performances for important visitors. The bear developed an extensive repertoire of sounds and gestures, each one perfectly calibrated to delight its audience. Frank marveled at Chatter's ability to read people and respond to their needs, providing exactly the kind of interaction that would bring them the most joy. One summer evening, as Frank sat in his rocking chair with Chatter's head on his knee, he reflected on the journey that had brought them together. The old firefighter, who had once saved lives for a living, had found his own salvation in the form of an abandoned bear cub. Their unconventional friendship had healed wounds that Frank had thought would never mend, and had given both of them a second chance at happiness. "They say animals can't talk," Frank said softly, stroking Chatter's fur as the bear made contented rumbling sounds. "But you've taught me that the most important words don't come from the mouth, but from the heart. What you say to me every day is this: I'm here. I understand you. And you're never alone again. You saved me more than I ever saved you, Chatter." Chatter responded with a long, gentle sound that seemed to express agreement and affection. As night fell over the Smoky Mountains, the bear's rumbling continued, like a story with no end, a conversation that would last as long as they both drew breath. In the years that followed, people hiking through the mountains would sometimes hear those distinctive sounds drifting through the trees, the warm, rumbling growls of a bear in conversation with its human companion. Frank and Chatter had become more than just local celebrities. They had become a symbol of the healing power of unconditional love and the profound connections that can form between the most unlikely companions. Their story spread beyond the mountains, inspiring others who had lost hope to believe in the possibility of second chances. Frank Morrison, the firefighter who had once saved others, had finally learned to save himself with the help of a remarkable bear who had taught him that family comes in many forms and that love, once lost, can be found again in the most unexpected places. As the seasons turned and the years passed, Frank and Chatter remained together, Two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed to heal. Their daily conversations continued, a unique language of love and understanding that transcended the barriers between species. In the end, they had created something beautiful together, a bond that proved that no one has to face life's challenges alone, and that sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected sources. The legend of the old man and the talking bear lived on, a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of second chances, and the remarkable capacity of the heart to heal when it finds the right companion. Frank Morrison had spent his career saving lives, but in the end, it was a small abandoned bear cub that had saved him.